Hello, I'm Christian Martai, and for my capstone question, I decided to focus on the death of intellectualism or the creation of anti intellectualism. And with this, I will touch briefly about how I went through anti intellectualism as a kid, what that was like, how I believe it's different from the modern use of it, um, how I suffered from it, how I eventually was able to regain my joy of learning, and how I think other people can go about helping others with this. When I when I was a child, I actually really enjoyed school. I loved learning. I loved all aspects of it. I would just teach myself math, English, science, everything but history, because that bored me as a child. But no one's perfect, and I had a lot of fun up until school really started pushing that what I was learning wasn't important because it wasn't on tests, and the only thing that mattered were grades. And it's like, well, if I'm only going to be punished for learning and exploring outside of the curriculum, why am I going to? And if the curriculum is so easy for me, why am I going to partake and engage with it in any meaningful way? And that was kind of my mentality from elementary school all the way up to high school. And but luckily, after high school, I was able to get into Duchess, where having more freedom in choices for what I was learning, as well as some really good professors. I at Duchess, I took marketing and business with Professor Willman, and he had his issues of sometimes being a little monotone, but when he was animated, you couldn't help but be enthralled in the discussion, and he made learning so much more engaging than just, okay, class, here are the slides, here's the text, here's the homework, here's the quiz. And he made group projects and presentations actually enjoyable because he understood their strengths, weaknesses, and how they could actually benefit people. But that was my experience with my electives that eventually led me here. But because I loved learning that, but some people didn't love it. Some people were only in it for the money. Some people only want to do education or higher education as a means to an end so that they can get a better paycheck, which that in and of itself isn't a bad thing. We are in a capitalist society. We do need to be able to afford to live. But there's a line between not loving what you're learning and actively pushing against it. Oh, this is what we're supposed to talk about. My Professor Willman. I did have an English professor that he was my English 101 and 102 or 201. And because when I first got into college, I still had a little bit of conservative roots with me from my family and blah, blah, blah. And I wrote a paper on gun control and gun reform. I no longer agree with the stance that I had in it, but it was about how it wouldn't be effective in the United States. The statistics of, how other crimes will increase in response to lack of guns. And he was a very, very leftist professor. He was openly gay, and he gave me an A. I cited my sources. I defended my arguments, and being able to have a discussion that slowly turned me more and more towards the left with him. I was already on that path, but he just kind of pushed me along even further. Helped break me out of the anti-intellectualism that I was still stuck in from high school. And I took him later on with creative writing classes, short stories, and he became instrumental to not to my education, but or yeah, to my education, not to my academics, but just the way that I learn and the way that I enjoy it was mostly because of him. And now on to the meat and potatoes of where I believe anti-intellectualism really started to creep into America. It's all goes back to Nixon. Everything always goes back to Nixon, and I'm going to ignore all of the racism that he pushed and focus solely on the anti-intellectualism and college. Because prior to Nixon, college didn't have tuition costs. But it wasn't until desegregation where, again, it's still a little bit of racism has to be talked about. And with the segregation, and they're like, well, we don't want minorities gaining any sort of foothold in marketable positions, so we're going to make college expensive. We're going to start charging them. And it's like, well, if we're charging minorities, might as well charge white people too, because more money, because capitalism. And you have skyrocketing costs of college, with college becoming less and less accessible. We start seeing a pushback in the higher levels of thinking that college promotes earlier and earlier, where even when I was a kid, there was the fun saying of, like, oh, like, why did the author make the curtains blue? And it's like, oh, it's to show the sadness, the loss. And it's like, no, the curtains were blue because the curtains were blue. And sure, it could be that the author just wanted to have a nice little detail of the curtains being blue, and it didn't have any significance to the story, character, anything. But you have to support that with reasonings from the source. You can't just say, yeah, it's blue because it's blue, and move on with it. That's not in good faith, it's anti intellectualism. And that sentiment never went away from elementary school through high school, where people were still talking about it and it just became more and more prevalent. And then there's the other side of anti intellectualism and bad faith of it's just a joke. The same thing with racist jokes, where there are comedians who will say some of the most disgusting stuff and act like it's just a joke. It's not that deep. It is that deep. If you didn't want a reaction, you wouldn't have said something like that to begin with. And now, can we actually do anything about this? As Bob says, can we fix this? And I think the best place to start with trying to fix it is on the personal level. Figure out our own weaknesses, our own biases, of where we become lazy when it comes to learning. Because learning is effort, it takes time and energy, which is hard to come by. But if we don't look into ourselves first, then we have no hope of being able to influence those around us. And then without being able to influence those around us, nearest proximity, then local schools won't change, and then the cascading effect of change will never even begin. And I would like to thank any and all of you for listening to me ramble. I hope this has inspired you to start your journey of, looking at your biases wherever they may be. And as my favorite band says, you know, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Have a good day.